Okay, to finish up on the physical, excuse me, physical aspects. One of the things that's really important to remember when you're looking at such a huge expanse of water and such small pieces of real estate is that you don't have what we call continental climate that you see in say, Europe, Asia, the Americas, or even Australia for that matter, in the sense that you don't have large enough land masses to basically generate their own climate system. What you basically have is a maritime system, excuse me, basically the Pacific Ocean defines the weather. And if you want to visualize, you can sort of visualize, for example, Hawaiian Islands is a good example. We don't have continental climate. What we have is basically we're like ships at sea. And so we're entirely at the mercy of storms or systems in the Pacific Ocean that happen to come this way or miss, when we're always worried about typhoons, for example. And this is typical of all the Pacific. So in Oceania, you don't have continental climates, which means, among other things, since most of it's in the tropics, you don't have seasonality in the same way. What you tend to have versus, winter, spring, fall, etc., is rather the times of the trades, which are generated again by the ocean, the North Pacific trades or the South Pacific trades, to what side of the equator you're on. And then that's followed by the Kona season, when the trades basically sort of collapse or disappear. We're in the last part of the Kona season right now, which is why it's usually the rainy period here. And in the South Pacific, it's sort of reversed in terms of time, but nonetheless, it's the same phenomena. So what you sort of have is two climatic periods. In this regard, it's somewhat similar to the typhoon you see in tropical Asia, but the typhoon tends to be a block of time, and it's pretty consistent, and it's much more dramatic in terms of weather differences. The Kona versus trade patterns that you see in Oceania don't tend to be quite as dramatic, though we get a huge proportion of our rainfall during the Kona season, as does most of Oceania. So for example, like this year when we didn't get very much rain, you're in a world of hurt, because like a monsoon season, you don't expect a lot of rain in the rest of the year. So this maritime dominance means it's very vulnerable to major wind factors like typhoons, hurricanes, whatever you want to call them, depending on which direction they're going. What it also means for a lot of the islands, since we're basically uplifted pieces of volcanic rock, and many of these are very eroded. So almost all of Micronesia consists of very small erosional platforms that are barely above the surface of the water. And those that are like Guam, they're slightly higher, basically consist largely of basically uplift reef formations that have been thrown up at angles. So by continental standards, there's almost no altitude. A little different in some of Polynesia, like here, say Samoa, Papeete, or Tahiti, and places like that, where you have larger leftover pieces of volcanoes, or in the case of the Hawaiian Islands, volcanoes are still active, so they have some altitude to them. But the key thing with this means is when you talk about global warming impacts and sea level rise, this is a part of the world where it's probably not most spectacular, at least financially or say socially, because you don't have large numbers of people. But 2-foot level sea level rise is pretty much going to wipe out the entire country at Kiribati, for example, since your mean level of land is only 6 feet above sea level. So if the water goes over the reef, then the island disappears, because basically it's a sandbar. So what in Oceania, the very dramatic aspects of sea level rise are probably more visible. And a lot of islands, since they consider very, very shallow coastal areas and then almost impassable mountains, sea level rise pretty much can shut off islands that actually have some altitude, but you're not going to have access to anything anymore, because your entire living area, if you want to think of it that way, is basically your reef coastal area. Having said that, since the populations are very small, and since there isn't a lot of resources, they're not really players at all in world travel except in tourism. It's not really going to have any major impact in the global financial or political or social spectrum. And that's one of the grim realities of being in Oceania. We're not really on people's radar, even government's radar at all, except oftentimes it's sort of like an example. And probably the most striking side effect of that is this. Let's switch here. Okay. Like some other areas, Asia to a certain extent, though, as I mentioned earlier, is a little more complicated. Sub-Saharan Africa, certainly, but the Pacific, especially the island Pacific, Oceania, is probably most strikingly of interest to cultural geographers like me, simply due to the fact that there's an enormous amount of stereotypes generated of this part of the world, but there's very little interest in what's actually there. And especially with the rise of tourism in the last 100 years, especially in the last 50, 60 years, if you want to make any money, in the global economic system, it's going to be largely through tourism. And what that means is it doesn't matter what being, for example, Tahitian really is about. It doesn't matter what the values are about. If you want to survive in the 21st century, given the fact that you don't generate any products that are really, compelling on the world market, except maybe vanilla beans, then you're pretty much going to have to buy into the stereotypes that the rest of the world has of you. And those basically are going to generate your identity. And because those are going to generate the income. Now, one of the weirder aspects of this part of the world is because the area is small, because the populations are small, because the populations in the Pacific really haven't moved in large numbers to other parts of the world. And even if they did, the total numbers are so small that, the entire population of most Samoas could move into California, and it wouldn't be anywhere near even like 1% of the population. So you could lose the entire population of most of Oceania into the continental United States or parts of Europe, and they would just vanish, in terms of, percentage of population. So they're just really small groups of people, relatively speaking. It doesn't make it any less important. But it does mean that when the world outside of Oceania, quote, discovers Oceania in the largely 1600s, they're not particularly interested in what folks in Oceania have to say about themselves. What they do is they take their stereotypes that they've already generated by then because of their colonial expanse into Asia, etc., and they basically redefine Oceania within their own set of stereotypes that they're generating, in London or Paris or Lisbon or wherever, and they're not interested at all in sort of checking their facts, if you want to think of it that way. That's a real good example of you make the world into what you want it to be or what you want to stereotype it as, and you're totally disinterested in what the world actually is. And that's still true today. Oceania, I would argue more than any place else on the planet, has very little leverage in controlling its own image. Its entire image is basically entirely generated by folks in other parts of the world, largely Europe and North America. And you see that's probably most dramatically here in Hawaii with Hawaii tourism, and also in French Polynesia, specifically Tahiti, Bonavona, etc., with their tourism. And the fact that you sort of come up with a new version of what being Polynesian is, which is almost entirely generated in Paris or Hollywood or something like that, and then becomes de rigueur the reality of the place. Because if you remember when we were talking about tourism earlier, tourism depends on stereotypes, and tourism generates stereotypes, and tourists want to see those stereotypes fulfilled. Tourists aren't interested in going someplace and learning about the reality of the place. They want what they think is authenticity. What they really want is that their stereotypes be validated. And in the Pacific, that has huge consequences, because when Europeans first figure out what Oceania is, they very quickly divide it into 2.5 categories. And these are still strikingly powerful even today, even though they have no basis in reality. Hang on. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so in this part of the world, what you have is the Europeans come in, they go discover these folks. They discover people on islands that by European standards, because you have to remember the Europeans live in the western tip of a continent. And European civilizations and the European world is very much a world of land. And you can still see this when you think of tourists that come here from the mainland or somewhere else, and they immediately go to the North Shore to see the big waves, because they're absolutely fascinated with the power of the ocean, the power of water, because it's not part of the world they're familiar with. They might live next to an ocean, but they don't really interact with it. It's not really part of their world. They're Euro-Americans and a lot of other Asians too are land-based people. Most folks in Oceania traditionally, until recently, in some cases still are water-based people. And so, it's not surprising, among other things, that what you find is in most of Oceania, there will be some sort of, the foundation story or foundation mythos of the place is that the original founding thing was of the ocean, and people came of the ocean. And therefore, everything on land was given by the ocean to a certain extent. That's very different than the Euro-Asian American, whatever ethos, which is, is all land-based. And so the ocean becomes something fearful that has dragons in it, or the world ends at the tip of an ocean or something like that. But you don't see the ocean as nurturing, the ocean as father or mother, as you do in the Pacific. So when the Europeans come in here and they see people living on, by their standards, incredibly small pieces of real estate and separated by enormous territory or enormous distances, again, by European standards, they just freak out. And so they then, among other things, don't bother asking the locals, how did you get here, or where you're, who you're related to, or something like that. And and even if people did tell them, they probably didn't really listen. What they did is they made up their own set of stories to explain to folks in the Pacific. And so the stories that were generated had nothing to do with people of the Pacific, but became stories of the Pacific, and then generated, ironically, images of the Pacific. And the classic division was of the two areas they noticed. In the eastern part of the Pacific, they decided that all these folks were very similar because they obviously spoke the same language. Tahitian, Samoan, and Hawaiian are all dialects of each other, for example. If you know East Maui Hawaiian, for example, you can sort of figure out Tahitian and vice versa. So what you have in what they called Polynesia was poly in the sense of a lot of islands with pretty much the same people on them. The islands to the western part, they defined as Melanesia. Melan is in dark skinned. And so basically they said that the folks that lived in the western part of the Pacific were actually related to folks from Africa. Now the folks to the north, that they were on the even smallest islands, i.e. Micronesia, they just called the reason micro because it was so small they didn't care about. So, if you're Micronesian, sorry about that, but to Europeans, you guys were, such a small group of islands, they didn't even bother coming up with a story how you got there. But again, none of this has anything to do with the people on these islands. This is stories about them generated by people that knew nothing about them and really didn't care. They just wanted a good story. And the islands provided, basically, if you want, a blank sheet of paper to write the story. Now, to make it even more complicated, the folks in the Western Pacific, who they see related as African, they then decide basically are barely, if human at all, and generally are subhuman. So you get the classic stereotypes that you get in the Western Pacific. A lot of the populations there were cannibals, they were headhunters, and and this, that, and the other thing, which, in part was true, but then you have to remember, for example, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh were all cannibals and certainly were headhunters when they were Celts. So, there's nothing unique in that. But that became the defining feature. So the Western Pacific became cannibalistic islands with jungles and creepy places and mysterious places and lost civilizations and stuff like that. Very much like they portrayed Africa. The Eastern Pacific, the Polynesian part, for some reason, I've never bothered figuring this out, is the Europeans decided that the folks in Polynesia weren't actually from the Pacific. So let's zoom out here really quickly. They decided that the folks in Polynesia were actually one of the lost tribes of Israel. Way back in the Old Testament time, the Israelites pissed off the Assyrians or some other group. I have to go back and read it again. In this part of the world, and these guys who were the big players came out and beat tar out of them. And in that leftover mess, one of the tribes, more accurately clans, disappeared in Israel. So one of the groups of Israelites vanishes from the history books. And this, for some reason, was a huge fascination in the 17, 18, 1900s with Europeans. I think probably because of their colonial empires, among other things, sort of, minor interest. Geez, can we ever find out what happened to that lost tribe? And so for some reason, and again, God knows why, they decided that the folks in the eastern part of the Pacific, i.e. in what they called Polynesia, were actually those people. They decided that Polynesians were actually the remnants of the lost tribe of Israel, who somehow had got sort of transformed or migrated, or God knows how, and ended up in this part of the world. And so what that meant to Europeans, since their view of social regional stuff was pretty bizarre anyways, was that Polynesians were actually Europeans with a really good tan and with black hair. So Polynesians weren't Indians, Polynesians weren't African, Polynesians weren't Asian. They were actually sort of like 85, 90% European. So they saw Polynesians as actually being people like them, and that immediately put them up on the chart above all these other groups that the Europeans were busy colonizing and controlling and telling them what to do. And so what you find, and this is very much still a part of Polynesia today, is that when the Europeans come and colonize and this part of the world, is there's a very sort of patronizing attitude towards their view of Polynesia. Right off the bat, they define Polynesia as being paradise, for example, or what's left of the Garden of Eden, which of course is still a huge view of our part of our tourism advertising. And it's ironic because the vegetation in French Polynesia, for example, is not hugely different than what you're going to find in Vanuatu or Fiji. But in Vanuatu and Fiji, that's jungle. When you get into Eastern Polynesia, then all of a sudden it becomes rainforest. It becomes something magical. And in that process, then you take the same plants and animals and you view them with an entirely different, color of tint on your glasses or something like that. And so what that also happens then is the people. Now, we don't have the time to get into it, but if you ever want to look at this, it becomes really bizarre when you look at Fiji, because the larger islands in Fiji have Melanesian populations on them. The Lau Islands to the southeast part of Fiji and Motuma to the north are Polynesians. And so what you find is the British who end up colonizing Fiji have an incredibly difficult time figuring out who they're looking at, but they were very clear that as far as they were concerned, Melanesians were not of the same quality, I suppose, for lack of a better term, as the Polynesians. And ironically, you still see this large part in Fijian politics, where your Polynesians still control a lot of the political system in Fiji, even though they're a minority part of the population. So one of the weird aspects of this then is there's a very clear pecking order in terms of how Europeans saw the people in the Pacific. Polynesians were actually Europeans or very close to them. So therefore you treat them very nicely. You watch out for them. In many cases, you actually protect them from the outside world. So the British set up a protectorate, for example, of Tonga. And what they do is they basically try to protect Tongans from the outside world. So the British control Tonga. The British tell the Tongans what to do. After all, it's still a colony. But on the other hand, they try to keep Tonga from becoming too civilized. And this becomes one of the main themes you find in Polynesia, is the idea that civilization, Euro-American civilization in the 19th and 20th centuries, people, rather realistically realized it wasn't all a good thing. And what they decided was, in that context, that Polynesians, since they actually reflected this part of the old history of the Old Testament, and therefore were like closer to the Garden of Eden, closer to what God intended people to be, they were the innocent, primitive children of God. And so in that context, then, these children of God had to be protected from the negative aspects of the modern world. And this became a huge part of sort of the way that the Polynesian colonial possessions were themed. And there's still a big chunk of that here in Hawaii and Hawaii tourism, where the idea that, the population is stereotyped as Hawaiians. Hawaiians are seen as being full of aloha. They're friendly with everyone. They're innocent. They're childlike and always like people. And they love to play and they don't necessarily like to work. I mean, all these enormous stereotypes that have nothing to do with Hawaiians at all. They have to do with the way that the Euro-Americans decided to portray Polynesians. But if you're of the Western Pacific, or if you're Melanesian, you get none of that. You're basically dirt. And it says something that you had basically in Australia, you had slavery, indentured servitude of, basically kidnapped folks from Melanesia right into 1910, 1915. Long after, that type of behavior was outlawed in Africa or some places like the 1830s, 1840s. If you were white Australian, you could still basically kidnap Melanesians right into the early 20th century, and no one was going to say anything about it. It was the last areas in the world you could do this. In fact, I think it might have been the last. And that's because Melanesians weren't seen as actually really being totally human, especially folks from New Guinea. And so, you still have stereotypes of Solomon Islanders, New Guineans, or, folks, Canucks, for example, New Caledonia, as head hunting savages. You go 500 miles to the east, and all of a sudden you got, Samoans or Tongans or Cook Islanders, or, and all of a sudden it's entirely different. You have to remember, Captain Cook is actually killed here in Hawaii, and parts of the body are originally consumed by chiefs. But here in Hawaii, because we're Polynesian, the blame was put on Cook. Cook shouldn't have let that happen. Cook shouldn't have done this. Cook shouldn't have done that. There's no immediately freaking out that that Hawaiians are cannibals. That same event occurs, for example, as it did in New Caledonia in the 1830s. And immediately the French take over the whole place, wipe out 2 villages, and declare the place a colony, because New Caledonians, or the Kanaka, are basically savages and headhunters and cannibals, and therefore you can't let them be in charge. So the same event, 2 entirely different reactions based on entirely different stereotypes of the islands, neither of which is based in the reality of the place. And that's the thing that's important to remember. No one cares, in the rest of the world, what Pacific Islanders are actually about, and what their value systems are, et cetera. There's very little interest in that. There's nothing like the interest that people have towards like Chinese stuff or Japanese stuff, where they really want to know what Chinese and Japanese are sort of up to. They get it wrong, but they want to know. To be honest, no one's interested in what happens, what people in the Pacific see about the world around them. And of course, it's worst of all, of course, if you're Micronesian, because in that context, the Europeans didn't even bother with stereotype. Okay, they just sort of left it as a big blank. There's sort of like a big chunk of ocean. Oh yeah, there's some islands there. Oh yeah, there's some people in there. And that was pretty much it. And so this very complex relationship, you want to see this classically. The classic way this plays out would be in the very sense you've got two British colonies here. You got the British colony of New Zealand, and the British also, of course, colonized Australia. In New Zealand, the relationship between the Maori, the indigenous, Polynesian population, and the Brits, i.e. the British coming that colonized the place, is both very fraught, engaged in a whole mess of wars. There's three main Maori wars or Anglo-Maori wars. They don't end until the 1850s or late 1860s, and violence continued after that. Nonetheless, even during that, the British relationship with New Zealand Maori was one where they actually saw the New Zealand Maori as being, real people and bum. At the same time, the Australians in the Australian British colonies, you could shoot Aborigines, the indigenous population there, without any consequence right into the 1880s, 1890s. You just, it was the same as shooting the kangaroo. There was no consequence to committing violence on Aboriginal populations because they were Black versus being Polynesians, who are actually sort of largely Europeans. And so these two British colonies are a classic example of this enormous difference that isn't based on the people that are there. It's based on the stereotypes of the people that colonize or control the region. And that's really the emphasis you have to understand the Pacific, because that defines who we were, who we are, and in large part, probably who we're going to be.